They called it unstoppable. They said it would change warfare forever. What the world saw instead was total failure, on camera, in real time. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of Russia's next-generation military arsenal. For years, state media and defense officials hyped it as the game changer, a weapon so advanced that NATO would scramble to respond. But when the moment of truth arrived, when Russia finally unveiled and tested its highly publicized hypersonic cruise missile, all that bravado came crashing down in the most humiliating way possible. What should have been a show of dominance became a global embarrassment. Within seconds of launch, the weapon veered off course, began to tumble, and ultimately disintegrated before ever reaching its target. Cameras rolling, military brass watching, and satellites above, all witnessing what was supposed to be the rise of Russian military might, ending in a flaming failure. This wasn't just a technical glitch. This was a catastrophic breakdown of years of planning, billions of rubles in funding, and endless hours of propaganda. The weapon, codenamed Strej by insiders, was touted as capable of reaching speeds over Mach 8, maneuvering unpredictably to evade modern missile defense systems. It was supposed to be Russia's answer to the West's military advantage, a missile that could strike anywhere, anytime, before anyone even knew what happened. But in reality, the launch painted a very different picture, one of a crumbling defense industry held together more by myth than by metal. The test site, deep in the Arctic Circle, had been carefully chosen to avoid international scrutiny, but nothing stays hidden in the modern world. Within hours of the failed test, satellite images, infrared heat trails, and even intercepted Russian communications began to circulate in intelligence circles. And when Western analysts confirmed what had happened, that Russia's most hyped new weapon had literally fallen apart mid-flight, the silence from Moscow was deafening. There was no press conference, no photo op, no congratulatory speech from the Kremlin, just damage control and silence. The failure couldn't have come at a worse time. Russia is already facing unprecedented sanctions, economic decline, and isolation from much of the world. Its military, once feared, has been exposed in Ukraine as vulnerable, disorganized, and often reliant on outdated Soviet-era equipment. The promise of new-generation weapons was meant to restore that lost fear, to tell the world that Russia was still a force to be reckoned with. Instead, this missile launch served as a metaphor for a regime more concerned with appearances than actual capability. What makes this even more shocking is the level of secrecy and pressure that surrounded the weapon's development. Former engineers now living abroad have started to come forward, some anonymously, others risking everything, to reveal how the project was plagued with problems from the start. Rushed timelines, lack of proper funding, and political interference turned what could have been a promising design into a ticking time bomb of flaws. One former technician described how quality control was often skipped entirely just to meet testing deadlines. Another revealed that software bugs were being patched in the final hours before launch. The political stakes were massive. Vladimir Putin himself had referenced the weapon in multiple speeches, claiming it would reshape the strategic balance and guarantee Russia's security for decades to come. In one particularly dramatic moment, he even showed an animation of the missile flying over oceans and striking enemy targets with pinpoint accuracy. The reality? A smoldering wreck on frozen tundra, its shattered parts scattered across the launch site. No pinpoint accuracy, no revolution, just failure. Military analysts across the globe were quick to react. In the US, Pentagon officials reportedly viewed the failed test as a confirmation that Russia's weapons development is suffering due to brain drain, corruption, and lack of modern infrastructure. In Europe, NATO countries took note. But behind closed doors, there was more mockery than concern. One official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "They're trying to project power, but all we see is decay. And the Russian people? They're starting to question." In online forums and encrypted messaging apps, murmurs of dissatisfaction have begun to rise. "Where is all the money going?" one user wrote. "They promised us the future, but we're stuck in the past." Another comment simply read, Another Potemkin weapon, just for show. The Kremlin, always obsessed with optics, is now scrambling to scrub any mention of the failed launch from state-controlled media. But in the digital age, such erasure is nearly impossible. But perhaps the most damaging consequence of the failed launch isn't external, it's internal. Within the Russian military-industrial complex, confidence has been shattered. Engineers and scientists who once felt pride in working for national defense are now demoralized. The pressure to perform, combined with fear of punishment, has created a toxic environment where innovation dies and blame thrives. Rumors are already spreading that heads will roll, not metaphorically, but literally. In Russia's closed system, failure isn't tolerated, and when it happens publicly, someone must pay the price. Still, amidst the chaos, some officials are trying to spin the story. They claim the failure was a prototype test and not meant to represent the final product. Others say it was sabotage, a desperate attempt to avoid admitting technical incompetence. But no amount of spin can change what the world saw: a failed launch, a broken missile, and the shattered image of Russian technological supremacy. This failure is more than just a military setback. It's a symbol of a regime increasingly out of touch with its own limitations. It proves that no matter how loud the propaganda, physics doesn't lie. And in a time where perception is everything, Russia's inability to back its claims with results is becoming painfully clear. The gap between what they say and what they can actually do is growing. And now the world has seen it in real time. So what happens next? Does Russia go back to the drawing board, or does it double down on denial and distraction? Will we see more rushed tests, or will the Strej missile quietly disappear from public mention, buried like so many other failed projects? And how will this impact Russia's already fragile position on the world stage? This story is far from over. The shock waves of the failed launch are just beginning to ripple. Inside the Kremlin, inside military labs, and across global alliances. What's clear is that the age of believing in Russian invincibility is fading. In its place, doubt. And doubt, in the world of geopolitics and military power, is often more dangerous than any weapon. In the days following the failed launch, the silence from Russia's top defense officials grew louder, not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew that anything they said could trigger more questions, more scrutiny, and more internal fallout. Behind tightly closed doors, crisis meetings were held across Moscow. The Ministry of Defense summoned top engineers, intelligence officials, and political advisors to assess the scale of the disaster. They weren't just discussing a failed missile, they were dealing with a collapse of credibility, a moment that could redefine Russia's military reputation not just internationally, but domestically. As the world dissected the footage and intelligence leaks, Russian state media launched into overdrive, not to explain the failure, but to bury it. New headlines were pushed out every hour to distract the population: border tensions, diplomatic spats, heroic stories from unrelated sectors. Yet the Strej failure had already taken root in the collective memory of not just observers abroad, but within the ranks of Russia's own military community. Young recruits in training camps whispered about the embarrassing test, while senior officers debated whether this would result in a complete shift in defense funding priorities. No matter how hard they tried to suppress it, the truth lingered. They had failed, publicly and without a scapegoat in sight. The deeper problem wasn't just the failure of the missile itself. It was that this launch represented the culmination of years of systemic decay. Russia's once proud scientific institutions have been drained by brain drain, corruption, and a suffocating political atmosphere that values loyalty over competence. Brilliant scientists have fled abroad, skilled engineers have either retired or been pushed out, and those who remain often work under impossible conditions. One anonymous insider leaked messages suggesting the test team had warned about instability in the flight control system weeks before the launch, but their concerns were brushed aside as unpatriotic pessimism. In a functional system, this would trigger reform. But in today's Russia, failure often results in deflection and punishment. Rumors are swirling that the head of the Strej project has been placed under investigation. Others fear more serious consequences, not just job losses, but criminal charges under vague national security laws. In this climate of fear, innovation struggles to survive. Engineers are no longer designing to excel. They're designing to survive, to avoid mistakes, and to keep their heads down. And that's the true tragedy behind the failure. The culture that made such a disaster not only possible, but inevitable. Russia's most hyped new weapon was supposed to be the future. Instead, it exposed the truth about the present, and possibly signaled a much bleaker future ahead. And as the world watches what Russia does next, one question hangs in the air like smoke from a failed launch. If this was their most advanced weapon, what does that say about the rest? Want the truth behind the headlines before they're erased or rewritten? Stay curious. Keep questioning. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. When power relies on illusion, exposure becomes resistance.